Hello, everyone. It is the last session of MEF Connect Cybersecurity, and we talk about one of those difficult topics for the industry, robocalls. So the calls, the marketing calls, somebody calls them, but the unwanted calls that you might receive. And you have heard it throughout the day, also referred as stir shaking, the technology that helps us to alleviate this problem. But I'm very happy to tell you that we are not just talking with some of the expert that knows something about it. We're talking with John Peterson, the VP and fellow at Neustar. John is not just, as I say, an expert, is a person that has got his fingerprints all over the technology and the standards, and not just this one, but STIR as being one of them, given his working in the industry for the last few years. John, very much welcome. We appreciate you, appreciate Neustar, which is one of those few certificate authorities around there. There's also doing stir shaking, so real experts, doing real things. So John, can you tell us a bit more about these questions? What's a stir shaking? What have we learned so far from the deployments in North America?
I'd be happy to, Dario. I mean, thanks so much for having me. I was really enjoying the last session as well. I'm very interested in messaging and how all of this is going to play out as part of the equation around all of this. So yeah, I do have a few slides. I don't know if you just want me to get right into them, but it's, yeah, I think we can share these. Can you see my slides?
It's coming. Yes, I can see it now.
Perfect. Yeah, so I mean, I was asked to come here and just explain a little bit of what we've learned so far, trying to implement stir shaken in North America, what our expectations are a bit, and what we think the implications of this are ultimately going to be for the global, right? The global struggle we're all engaged in against the scourge of these either annoying or in many cases fraudulent robocalls. And I mean, you know, when you get into it, this is the problem, right? I mean, you know, we hear this most from enterprises in North America. These are companies that are trying to contact consumers legitimately, and, you know, no one trusts the phone anymore. But, you know, telephones historically have been so useful in connecting consumers with enterprises in a trusted way. But if you've got, you know, 50 billion robocalls coming through, you know, in 2020. So many of these turn out to be scams of some form or another. This has forever been the #1 complaint to the relevant regulatory agencies in the United States, that, you know, can't you please do something about this? And moreover, it's like the #1 way that scammers are actually trying to contact and frankly, to exploit consumers. So somebody has to do something about this, right? I mean, there's so much money that's lost to it. And, you know, many consumers today that are trying to be reached by valid enterprises just won't bother picking up the phone anymore. This is kind of like an existential threat, I guess, to the telephone network and the way that we've traditionally used it, which would be a shame if this really disappeared as a modality, because it is so valuable to be able to, in real time, communicate with someone, resolve issues. We all know that this is an important part of how consumers and enterprises interact. So what are we doing about this? So, I mean, I know since I worked early on the security for SIP, for the Session Initiation Protocol, nearly 20 years ago now, it's hard to believe that's when we were doing that work. You know, I was always interested in the question of like how we get an identity for called parties to work in SIP. You know, SIP borrowed a lot from email, right? And so we basically just borrowed the from header field from email, which, as everyone knows from the endless amount of email spam, is something that people can pretty much populate arbitrarily. There are standards like, for example, DKIM that have grown up to try to address that. And you can look at STIR as something that started to develop at roughly the same time in the 2003-2004 timeframe. And this was work we did in the Internet Engineering Task Force, a place where I've been very active. It's the group that has effective change control over SIP. And, you know, we got some complaints from the FCC in particular asking us, would you mind taking another look at this, given that so many of the robocalls out there are IP originated, right? And so much of the IP infrastructure that has ended up being implemented in North America is SIP-based. And of course, this is also true for the IMS and 3GPP and for many other communication systems for telephones around the world today. And, you know, since we'd taken a look at this for a while, you know, the name I came up with for this was Secure Telephone Identity Revisited, or STIR, which is a protocol suite that describes a way that you can sign telephone calls, that when you're sending SIP signaling, though not exclusively SIP, I'll talk about this a bit later on, but like when you send a SIP call, you can have a little piece of, signed information that shows kind of who the carrier was that is responsible for this call, and gives you a sense of basically whether it's likely that the called party number that's in a SIP call has actually been spoofed. And, but we wrote STIR as a global standard, as something that would be applicable to a variety of operating environments. And it was really ATTES that took over this work on Shaken, which provides a governance framework and some extensions to SIP that are in particular relevant to the way North American operators get numbers, the way that they interact, and so on. So yes, this has been a thing for a while. I'll show you some of the timeline of this in a moment. But obviously, this very month, the end of this very month, is the deadline for carriers in North America, in America at least, to start implementing this. So I talked a bit about Shaken a moment ago. This kind of gives you a sense of what the key components are that play in the STIR Shaken architecture as it's emerged in the United States. The thing that you see at the top there, the top line, obviously this is connected to the FCC, to regulatory authorities, and they are coupled to a body that we call the Governance Authority for SIP, for STIR Shaken. The Governance Authority is basically responsible for setting policies for who can get certificates, what carriers or perhaps non-carrier entities are actually eligible to get the certificates that you use to sign these objects that get carried along with SIP calls. Then there's a policy administrator, a PA, and the policy administrator's job is to execute the policies that the Governance Authority has put in place. And so in particular, if you're a carrier, and you can imagine all of the stuff kind of below that top line as being stuff that lives in a carrier network, you go to the policy authority to get permission to get a certificate from a CA. And as Dario alluded to earlier, we're one of the people that's providing this CA function in the United States. Neustar also does the PA function up in Canada. Now, once you get a cert, there's a set of keying material that's associated with that. There's a public key and a private key, these components of a typical certificate. It's very similar to Web PKI, if people are familiar with how web stuff like that works. And so there's a need to kind of divert that keying material in two directions. There's a private key you're supposed to keep super secret. You need to have a special system for key management that make sure that only you have access to your private key. But that private key is utilized by something we call an authentication service. That's the STIAS. And that entity practically is what will be doing the call signing. Now, you also want relying parties, terminating side people, to be able to validate the signatures created by STIR Shaken. And so the KMS in the middle sends the public part of that key out to something we call a certificate repository. That's the STICR that you see here. And when a call arrives at a terminating side, it is the verification service, the STIVS, that gets the public key of the calling party's network and uses that to validate, okay, we know this was the carrier who actually vouched for this call coming through. And then this is just a quick example that shows kind of how that works in practice. If you just look at it from a protocol level, if you have an originating service provider, they'll have access to this keying material, the authentication service. When a calling party generates a call, it will go through the originating carrier's network, get signed by the AS, and it may go through one or more transit networks in the middle, but ultimately it lands on the terminating side where that verification service, as I said, gets access to the public key of the OSP and uses that to validate that the call is correct. And then when this gets sent on to the called party, some kind of display will be invoked. This really depends on how rich the capabilities are of the endpoint device that this lands on for the called party. You'll see some kind of check mark or verification mark or whatever. That really, the STIR standards don't place a lot of bounds around that, right? We want there to be some innovation in that space, so it's not something where we stipulate the user experience like must be this or that. Though we imagine over time, as this gets rolled out, there will be largely more standardization surrounding that. Now, one wrinkle you see here at the bottom is this attestation or trust indicator of A, B, or C that gets attached to a STIR Shaken call as it goes by. And these are Shaken concepts. These weren't really built in originally to baseline STIR. But it's basically a way for the originating service provider to characterize their relationship to the calling party's number. And the high-level idea is, if this is like one of your customers and you know precisely who this person is, you bill them, right, every month or whatever it is, that's when you use a full attestation. This is a number I assigned, it's a number I own, and this, I know the consumer that has it, and if they are being bad, I know how to contact them and tell them that they're not behaving properly. A partial attestation is for a variety of cases where, for example, a block of numbers has been assigned to an enterprise, right, by an originating service provider. They don't exactly know how that enterprise has chosen to associate particular call agents, for example, or offices with those numbers. So it's not like they particularly know whose number that is, but they do know it's their number, and that they have some business relationship with whomever it is that's actually divvying the numbers up this way. There's also a relatively strong attestation to make. That's the B attestation. And finally, there's the C attestation. And this is for cases where, for example, you received a call from an international gateway, from an ISUP gateway, where this has come out of a, kind of a trust network of ISUP. You don't really know, though, right? It's not your number. You're not really sure who's vouching for it originally. You're just kind of sure of what the gateway is that it landed on. And so C is the weakest attestation. But this broad concept helps the terminating service provider to know how strong that level of assurance is. And it could be, for example, a policy on the terminating provider side would have a different way of attesting through the user interface the strength of confidence, right? That this is not a spoofed call based on these levels of attestation. And these concepts have been brewing for some time now. Again, a number of different fora are working on them now globally. Obviously, this first started in the ITF back in 2013. I was actually stuck at an airport bar, it's a true story, going to what was going to be the first meeting. That's when it was stir, because I was stirring a drink at the time. But that's also a running joke for SIP. We have a lot of kind of drink name things that we've standardized with SIP over the years. But when ATTES got involved in this and started figuring out what it would mean to apply this to what we call the IPNNI, the IP network-to-network interface that ATTES has standardized for North American carriers to exchange SIP traffic. ATTES worked in concert with the SIP Forum to develop a set of standards, practices, and a governance model for that. But there's still a tremendous amount of work that has gone on in now 8 years since we really started working on SIP. We took it slow, made sure we got all the stakeholders we wanted in, and that we kind of knew what everyone wanted from this. And this obviously went from an American United States project to also a Canadian project. And now I actually am working with NICC. I'm vice chair of, in the UK, the NICC CLI nuisance calling task force there. And I've also been working quite a bit in the GSMA. And I'll talk a bit more about the GSMA efforts in a moment, as they've looked at the ways that STIR/SHAKEN or similar technologies could be used to cut down on some of the robocalling and nuisance calling cases for them. This slide I'm not even going to talk through. This basically is just your reference if you want to go look at what the core documents are. If you Google for RFC 8224 or Google for the ATTES specifications you see on the right-hand side, this will let you see kind of what the work is that's going on around this and the core things people are implementing in advance, as I said, of this very close now, this imminent deadline. Once we got serious about this, regulators did take note. They appreciated that we were looking into this, and in United States, this culminated in December 2019 with the passing of the TRACED Act. And in particular, as the FCC has interpreted the TRACED Act and so on, a deadline was set at the end of June 2021 for carriers who have a VoIP capability to implement STIR/SHAKEN. The way that it is divvied up is, if you're really doing SIP traffic, you should be doing STIR/SHAKEN. If you're not, you need some other kind of reasonable robocall mitigation solution. And you're actually under an obligation to register with the FCC which of those two paths you've taken. And as of September, people that have really, any carriers who haven't expressed what they're doing with this, as I interpret the regulation, this carriers may block calls that are not actually compliant with either STIR/SHAKEN or an alternative reasonable robocall mitigation solution. A similar track has been taken in Canada. where their regulator, the CRTC, has mandated caller ID authentication with STIR/SHAKEN. There have been some delays in this. Obviously COVID has impacted everyone's schedule for everything. I believe the current deadline for that is November at this point. But already there have been cross-border calls. Already we're seeing even, I'd say, quite a few non-US numbers being attested that are being signed in just in the US from non+1 CLIs. So this is becoming a much more diverse and internationalized ecosystem already. And as I mentioned, I've been doing some work with Ofcom and with NICC, exploring what a STIR implementation framework might look like. If I had to guess, by the end of this year, there will be a pretty good picture of what it'll look like, of kind of what the standard would look like for the UK. Well, I have no inside track or intelligence on when that might turn into some kind of like regulatory mandate, but it's certainly something that Ofcom is very concerned about, I can say, from the many conversations I've had with them. And of course, there are plenty of other regulators that are at earlier stages on this. I have calls with them all the time around the world who are kind of feeling out, well, I think a lot of people want to see how well this goes in the United States and how much of a dent this ends up making. But I fully expect that we will see some other countries moving, if not to mandate this shortly. There are certainly plenty of exploratory efforts that are studying it at the moment. And just to give you a sense, this is actually a Neustar slide we show. Since we operate this thing, it's called the ATTEST test bed, which is a place to just kick the tires in implementations, make sure that STIR/SHAKEN is interoperable. Obviously, like any SIP interconnection, it's complicated. There are a lot of options. Everyone wants to make sure it works. But this at least gives a sense of some of the vendors and the operators who have gotten on board with this. And it's a pretty substantial number, quite frankly. I mean, quite a few people are very interested, not just among US carriers, but also we've been doing quite a bit of testing internationally with some of the entities you see listed on the lower right of the slide there. And one thing I always want to say when I talk about STIR/SHAKEN and what it's going to do, everybody always asks me, okay, so we're gonna put in this technology that gives you a strong assurance that a call isn't spoofed. Is that really going to solve the robocalling problem? And the answer is, of course not, right? I think what it really practically does is it gives you an indication of who the carrier is that is vouching for the calling party number. And if it turns out that they're not vouching for calling party number as well, there is traceback and accountability, and as we say in the security business, cryptographic non-repudiation, right? That says this carrier used their key to sign this, and if it turns out they're doing something wrong, you have a much stronger assurance of this than you ever had in the traditional like SS7 ISUP world, right? It really facilitates traceback for that. But moreover, for those sign calls, one of the problems we've always had with analytics in trying to beat robocalling is if you find out somebody's sending bad calls from a spoof number, you can mark your spoof number, that the spoof number they're using in the database. All that does is just make them change to another spoof number, right? What analytics really does is that as STIR/SHAKEN gets widely implemented, it gets harder to hide that, right? It gets harder to spoof more. It gets harder to just switch numbers arbitrarily. The threat surface is reduced.